Okay.
Hello, everybody. Oh,
hello.
Hi there. I'm Queen G. I don't think we've had the chance to meet yet. I'm hosting the conference next couple of days. So it's nice to get into the first parallel session here. Are you all ready for me to introduce the session?
Yes.
Yes. So this session is Race, Power and Privilege in Human Rights Work. It's a parallel session. And I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce the amazing facilitators, and I'm sure you can introduce yourself much better. Race, Power and Privilege in Human Rights Work. This session will equip participants with practical awareness and skills to tackle everyday instances of racism and bias in their work. Using an intersectional feminist framework, this presentation will challenge participants with their own instinct bias and as well as discuss empowerment, allyship, and the importance of lived experience-driven leadership. I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Lang. Please give us a wave, Elizabeth. Is the founder of CEO of Diversity Focus. Her area of expertise include intersectional diversity and inclusion, domestic and family violence, and human rights, particularly in relation to migration and refugee pathways. Elizabeth Tekanyo, Diversity Focus, is a director of strategy and operations. She delivers a number of workshops across various streams as a trainer facilitator, and her interests range from teaching allyship and anti-racism work, cross-cultural, sexual and reproductive health, as well as inclusive human rights work. Shabnam Safa is a national refugee-led advisory and advocacy group. Shabnam is a driven community development practitioner, passionate about cultivating true partnerships between communities and structures of power to create lasting solutions. Inspired by her own lived experience, she's a strong advocate for meaningful engagement and participation of refugees in addressing the complex challenges of forced migration and resettlement. So I'd like to pass it on to you now, and I'll come back at the end of the session just to remind everybody to fill in the feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll kick off. So welcome to the session, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day. We're really looking forward to engaging with you for the next hour and a half on a topic that we are very, very passionate about, and a topic that we believe is critical in terms of human rights work. We'll start off with some of the principles, but before I go further into the presentation, I'd just like to make a few remarks, just of some things to keep in mind. I think it's really important to just be aware that realistically, the topic that we're talking about is not something that you can really unpack to the degree that I think it needs to be in one workshop. So with that said, we're going to touch on some key principles that are really important to start getting you thinking around the concepts of race and power and how that intersects specifically with the work that you do. We'll make sure that we have some question time at the end just for people to ask questions. We do encourage you to use the chat box throughout if you have questions that come up, or if you're reflecting on something and there's something that that might be in the back of your mind, please feel free to use the chat box and put those questions in as they come. At the end, we will look through some of those responses. We may not be able to get through all the questions that we get given the number of participants that we have joining us, but we'll do our best to address some of the key questions that come up. Also, just to sort of emphasize, in terms of language and terminology to be aware, we are going to use the term people of color throughout the presentation today. And just to sort of acknowledge that in terms of my, I guess, place in the presentation today, I speak here as a Black woman. I share from my own personal experiences of race and racism. And I guess so we frame the workshop with that in mind, but it's also important to acknowledge the fact that there is a diversity of lived experience of racism. We use the term people of color. We use that term as an encompassing term, but we also recognize the fact that it is a broad term and there are various levels of comfort around the use of the term people of color. And it's not in any way to sort of suggest that people of color as a group are homogenous. We know that there's a diversity of experience, but there's a common element in terms of the experience of racism. And we'll be talking in terms of positioning, issues of power and privilege, and how that relates to, people of color broadly, but also how that intersects, more importantly, with your work in the area of human rights. So be mindful that that's a word that's going to come up again and again. It's really important for us today that we create an inclusive space for people of color to feel comfortable. We also recognize that a lot of these concepts of people that have a lived experience of racism, that these concepts can be particularly triggering and can be challenging to sort of address. So I want you to be aware of that for those of us that are sort of coming into the workshop with a lived experience. And also just to emphasize the fact that in speaking about issues of racism today from a lived experience perspective, it's important that we keep in mind the need to work together in order to dismantle systems of racial oppression. And that allyship piece, which Liz will speak to, is a huge part of how we dismantle racial oppression. So we'll speak to that.
Yep, and I'm your co-facilitator, Liz Tekanyo. We both are Elizabeth, so for ease. I see that the chat has been disabled for now, so we will have a Q&A at the end of the session, but please feel free to refer to her as Elizabeth and myself as Liz. I'm a white Swedish Armenian American. That's my racial and ethnic background. I'm here today as a co-facilitator to emphasize and exemplify what it looks like to be in an allyship role, particularly for the white participants joining us today. As an ally, I represent a personal commitment to supporting and improving the lives of people of color, even though I'm not part of those communities myself, and I do not have a lived experience of racism. A big part of allyship, and we'll go into this later on, but it's the fact that allyship does not speak for people of color, but rather comes from an empathetic framework, which underpins our workshop today. I acknowledge that, and this is also important, that I come from a position of privilege. I do not know everything. I'm learning every day. I learn and take things in from my colleagues, and I recognize and can appreciate the burden on people of color as they relive experiences, not only for Elizabeth as she presents, but also for those of you in the audience, reliving those potentially triggering experiences of racism, and the difficult work we do to try to educate others. So we'll go into this more, but this is kind of framing the session today.
Awesome. Before we continue, I know that we're all coming from various traditional lands. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the custodial owners of the land in which Liz and I live and work, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And I also want to extend this to other First Nation people across Australia as well that represent the respective lands and countries that you come from. We pay our respect to the elders past and present, and also want to extend this to anyone who may be of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage that may be joining us today. I want to acknowledge the fact that sovereignty never ceded in Australia, and we stand in solidarity as allies for the ongoing struggle for recognition of our First Nation people as well. I know that in terms of acknowledging country, it has become somewhat customary, but I think there's huge synergies, and I think the significance of this speaks to what we're talking about today in terms of power and privilege and racism in the context of our work. And I think we can never underestimate the fact that even though we're talking very much from the perspective with a refugee lens, looking at issues of race and racism through that perspective in terms of the work that you do, we cannot deny the rich history that very much has links to these issues of racism and oppression, not only historically, but as it presents today as well. So just want to make that link. And I know that we know this, but I think it's particularly key that we are continually mindful, not only of country, but also of past oppression and current systems of oppression as well that continue to disadvantage and disempower Aboriginal communities. We also want to acknowledge the lived experience. I know that talking about issues of race and racism can be not only uncomfortable, but it can be traumatic as well, because it does bring up, I think, for a lot of people, feelings, and whether that's linked with past or current trauma, but it does bring up a lot for people. So I want to acknowledge that there is a discomfort to talking about these concepts, particularly for people that have a lived experience of racism and oppression, that some of these concepts can trigger many emotions in people. So we want to thank you for being present with us today. For those of you that are part of the presentation who have that lived experience of racism daily. I also want to acknowledge, I think, given the times that we're in with COVID restrictions, hence why we're all online, I want to acknowledge also the challenge of the present times as well, and how those systems of oppression also intersect to create particular experiences that may be quite unique for people of color, for example. So our group guidelines, where I think these are some basic principles that really underpin the work that we do and underpin, I guess, the approach that we're taking to the workshop. Now, these guidelines are not unusual to anybody. These are sort of everyday, I guess, what we expect in terms of the work that we do. But I just want to highlight the importance of respect. Liz, Shabnam, and I definitely come from a place of respect for the work that we do and the concepts that we're talking about, but we also invite you as participants to sort of come into the space with that as well. And I think a key part of that is empathy, in order sometimes to be able to work through some of these concepts, and particularly when we become triggered by anything that sort of brings something to light for us. It's important that we continue to keep in mind the importance of empathy and how that is really crucial, not only for the work that we do, but for helping us to continue to sort of evaluate ourselves as we come into contact with maybe experiences or that may be different to our own or may be difficult for us to understand. And I think also non-judgmental attitude is really key. There may be things that come up that you might have some questions about, and it's important that we come into the space with a willingness to want to learn. And I think with that comes, being able to sort of be non-judgmental of what we hear, and being open to maybe other ways of being and other ways of seeing that may be quite foreign to our own personal experiences. Participation and engagement. Liz has mentioned the chat box, which I think will be opened at some point. It's closed at the moment, but we will have time for questions at the end. So we encourage you to engage with us. If you do have questions throughout, feel free to please just record them as you go along. Equal airtime, I guess, just being mindful, we will try to do what we can to respond. Someone said it might be open. We'll do what we can to respond to your questions, but we also invite you to, we just want to remind you that, we may not necessarily get to everyone's questions, but we'll try our best to provide that sort of equal airtime for people that may have questions. In terms of confidentiality, it's just key that we keep this in mind. Sometimes people may have questions and may contextualize their questions with an example or a story. It's just really important that you do that with respect to the confidentiality of people's whose stories you may be sharing, and not to sort of divulge information that may identify anybody. And with that comes sharing sensitively as well.
Okay, looks like chat is open. We just can't respond to the things on the chat, but as we see them come through, given that we keep pace with time, we will respond to the chats. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of our session outline, so we'll start off with key concepts. This is really important to frame the presentation today. So some of those concepts are race, ethnicity, nationality, culture, and racism. We'll talk through the notion of power and privilege and how that intersects with your work, and also unpacking systems of racism as well. So we'll look at systemic racism. What does this look like and what does this mean in the context of human rights work? We'll explore a little bit on unconscious bias and this notion of saviorism in human rights or refugee advocacy work. We'll talk through allyship as well, what that looks like, what that means for the work that we do. And then we'll look at lived experience-led leadership. What does that mean? Why is that central to the work that we do? And Shabnam will be speaking to that specifically in the context of the role of NRAAG as well. So very much from a conference-led perspective.
Thank you. So I'll be kicking us off now with our key terms. And this photo was on the cover of National Geographic in 2018. And this is really to highlight how ethnicity and race intersect. So this is Millie and Marcia Briggs. They were 11 years old when this was taken in 2018. They're mixed race fraternal twins. So this is now allowing us to start looking at how we can pick apart the differences between ethnicity and race. They often get conflated, especially in Australia. And the different realities that although both of these girls have the same ethnicity, they have the same parents, they will have a very different lived experience in terms of their racial identities and the identities that others will place on them based on what they perceive as a racist. To kick us off, if anyone can quickly maybe throw in the chat a definition that they think race is, and then we'll start from there. Definition of race. No wrong answers, just throw it out there.
And it's not a textbook definition either. So what comes to mind when you hear the word race?
Sorry, but I don't think the chat is working.
Yeah, same. No?
Now it's not working, no.
Okay, no worries. We'll just race through this. So race is an extrinsic factor or an identity. It's not something that we necessarily determine. I mean, I could identify as Black, but that's not what society deems me as, and that would not be socially acceptable. It's a socially constructed concept, referring to the grouping of people based on similar physical or biological attributes such as hair texture, skin color, and it's a relatively narrow set of options. Let's see. Ethnicity, on the other hand, are your intrinsic factors. So that's your cultural and family background and heritage. I wouldn't necessarily know what your ethnicity is when I walk up to you. You would have to tell me what that is for me to know what that is. However, I would be able to determine your race when I see you across the street. It's not something that you can. For people of mixed race, there might be different periods and different social or cultural settings that shift that concept of race, but generally speaking, ethnicity is intrinsic, race is extrinsic, and it's a social construct. Culture is our shared values, beliefs, social norms passed down from generation to generation. It can be both material and immaterial. And it's kind of those shared values and norms that we have that we're raised in. And culture, again, can shift depending on where you live, who you're married to, dating, who your friend circles are, et cetera. You're able to, it shifts as you go through your life. Nationality. So nationality is another thing that isn't static. So you can be born into a certain nationality, and then that can shift depending on migration. It's not a static position. So nationality changes throughout your life. Prejudice, those are the values, attitudes, and beliefs that you hold against a particular group. And that in the context for today, it'll be basis of ethnicity, race, but it can also be on other dimensions of diversity, such as religions, sex, gender, et cetera, et cetera. The difference between prejudice and discrimination is that prejudices are just those thoughts that then can turn into actions, which is now your discrimination. And that's the unjust or prejudicial treatment of people based on the basis of their race. So that's when those biased thoughts turn into discriminatory actions. Together, this comes to create what we deem as racism, and we're really strong here at Diversity Focus that racism is not necessarily just a collection of individual acts against people based on race, but is also looking at the wider context of colonialism and the power structures that underpin systemic racism, which is our next concept, which looks at the hierarchical structures in our society that place white people at the top and people of color to different degrees going down, and recognizing that it's not just that person's problem or this person's problem, but as a society, it's everyone's problem. Lastly, we have xenophobia and ethnocentrism. A lot of times racism and xenophobia get mixed up. So as a white person, I might get discriminated against because of my American accent, for example, which would be accentism. That would not necessarily be racism, obviously, because I'm white and come from a place of privilege, but would be xenophobia where I am treated as an outsider. So xenophobia is a kind of a fear or a pushing back against foreigners. Ethnocentrism is seeing your culture as the center of everything. So traveling to certain Asian countries where chopsticks are used and refusing to use chopsticks because a fork and knife is the only way, or colonialism, for example, going into another country and pushing your ways on other cultures, saying that your culture is the only right way. Lastly, just take a moment to kind of really absorb this image. These are some different examples of racial microaggressions. They're the everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights, snubs, or insults that could be intentional or non-intentional. So I think a lot of times people think racism is a really conscious process, but rather 80–90% of racist acts come through very insidious, unconscious questions and comments, and both verbal and nonverbal that might not necessarily be in that person's conscious awareness, but have hurtful impacts. This is important because these microaggressions overlap with other dimensions of our identity. And so Liz is going to go into that as well, looking at the intersections of how these daily experiences intersect overall and create greater structures of oppression and disadvantage more on a structural level. So starting small and then now growing to looking more at the wider system of oppression.
Okay, so I'll just give you a moment to reflect on this wheel. I know there's a lot there. So maybe glance over and just be aware of sort of what thoughts or questions come to mind. So this illustration developed by Sylvia Ducksworth is a wheel of power and privilege, and it can help us get a more detailed visualization of what the term marginalization actually looks like and means, particularly in terms of how different categories of oppression can intersect to create further disadvantage or more entrenched oppression for certain groups within society. In terms of looking at this, it's important that you are able to sort of place yourself within the categories and look at where do you sit within the wheel, because you'll find that you have various levels of disadvantage and privilege depending on different aspects of your identity. So if you take into account, for example, I can't see it. So if you take into account gender, for example, being trans, intersect, or non-binary, for example, versus being cisgender and being a man, that's very different levels of privilege attached to each sort of experience. Similarly, if you looked at appearance, or if you looked at housing or wealth, you've got different degrees of advantage and disadvantage. So depending on where you sit in the wheel, you will find that your daily experience of life is very much influenced by those different intersections that you have. For me, as a woman, as a Black woman, as a straight woman, I have particular experiences because of my racial identity, because of my sexual identity, because of my gender. There are times that, and quite often, I guess when you think of how those intersections sort of merge, I may have more entrenched experiences of, disadvantage in circumstances where being a woman and being Black as an intersection actually works against me. For example, going for an employment opportunity where I may be well qualified, or perhaps, I may present in terms of my experience, educational background, etc., as most suited to a position, but the intersection of my gender and my race might deem me, I may experience, I guess, disadvantage in terms of the interviewees or the interviewing panel having particular expectations or assumptions of my ability to perform the job because of my gender identity as well as my race, as an example. So in terms of what does this mean for you specifically? So if you were to sort of reflect on where you might sit in the wheel, reflect on, firstly, where would you locate yourself within the wheel? In terms of those various intersections that you can see there, such as your formal education, sexuality, your mental health, your wealth, your language, etc. You might also want to consider, do you think that there are categories that might be missing in the wheel? What do you think about the categories that are depicted here? Yeah, so we've got someone, we've got a remark in the chat box, which is very valid, that the power of English is only valid in English-speaking countries, the same as monolingual English speaker in a multilingual society. Everything can be equal. Everything else being equal would be disempowered off the wheel. So that's a really good reflection. In terms of the work that we do, I guess just to sort of highlight, in an English-speaking context, I guess depending on where you are in society and what the dominant language is, that can shift and change as well. So in a society where, English is not the dominant language, for example, this wheel could look quite different. So the context for the wheel does vary and does change depending on where you are geographically, depending on the historical context of the place that you're in as well. So thank you for highlighting that. Okay. Now, this brings us to our next concept of systemic racism. So systemic racism works hand in hand with this notion of power and privilege. Liz has described that racism is more than just an individual issue. When those experiences of racism become collective, common, everyday experiences that is built into the system or into the various systems within society, it becomes systemic racism. So it's not so much that, I encounter racism walking down the street, and that's just one person who is just being mean and nasty towards me, Elizabeth, as an individual. It's looking at the broader structural context in which these everyday experiences exist. So systemic racism or institutional racism refers to how some of these ideas around white superiority are captured in everyday thinking at very systemic levels. So this would be, educational institutions within society, for example. It would be institutions of law, institutions of religion, institutions of, around employment. So every aspect of society is impacted by ideas of what it means to be, superior and inferior. And I think a lot of the times people struggle with this because I hear a lot of backlash against this notion of systemic racism, or even acknowledging that institutional racism exists, because people are still very much, they're sort of really stuck on looking at racism as everyday or individual personal experiences. I think the other aspect of it also is that people often look at racism as sort of, so it's about, if you're a member of the Klan, or if you're a part of a white supremacist group, for example, then you are racist. I think there's a huge disconnect between what racism actually means and how people sort of understand it. Particularly, I mean, I can only speak for the Australian context, because this is where I spent the vast majority of my life. And what I've seen in Australia is that there's a lack of an understanding and a lack of appreciation of what racism means, how it operates, and how that then intersects with institutions to create systemic racism. I think someone's got a, yeah.
Shabnam was just replying.
Okay, yeah. So these systems can include, as I mentioned, laws or regulations, social systems that sort of go unquestioned. And it also stems from education, hiring practices, or access to employment opportunities. I know that in the context of the work that a lot of you do, you're probably aware of people who are overqualified or have qualifications that are not recognized in Australia, for example, whether they be, an Iraqi surgeon who's got 10 years of experience in surgery in Iraq is not recognized in Australia, and therefore only has opportunities for employment around, factory work, for example. And in terms of that, I mean, not that there's anything inherently wrong with those jobs either, but somebody probably didn't spend 10 years of their life studying surgery, coupled with 10 or 20 years of experience as a surgeon, to then end up doing menial work, for example. So that's an example of where those structures or those systems work to create disadvantage for certain groups. So similarly, a surgeon who comes from an English-speaking country, and this is where the privilege of language again comes from, that intersectional wheel, wouldn't have as hard a time having their qualifications or their experience recognized, even if they had less experience compared to the Iraqi surgeon who's got 20 years experience, for example. So the ways in which laws and policies and practices operate to create certain levels of disadvantage for certain groups within society is sort of the key thing. Okay, so we're going to go into, you can see that there's some words that come up on the slides. I just want you to sort of pay attention as you read each word. I want you to pay attention to what comes up in terms of imagery and maybe thought. So just take a moment.
And these are just the first initial thoughts, even words. If you have a pen and paper, just write them down. But it's that initial reaction and those initial references that you make when you see each of these words.
The term CALD stands for culturally and linguistically diverse. And another interesting term, in my opinion. So I guess keep those thoughts in mind. If there's particular things that you want to share, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Keeping in mind, it's really your initial thoughts, imagery, and ideas that come up when you read each of these words. Now, I just want to highlight that this can be triggering for people, this activity. We've often done it in person, so it's a little bit different in terms of where sort of putting it into an online format. But in reflecting on what's come up for you as far as the thoughts and the imagery, it may not be what you consciously think about some of these words, but it's important that you are, I guess, paying attention to what comes up in terms of those initial feelings and ideas. We recognize that these words, you know, they are, I guess you could argue that they are used as labels. And that's an interesting discussion as well. But I just want you to pay attention to what's come up. If anyone is comfortable to share on any of the words, and you're comfortable to put that in the chat box, we won't, you know, mention your name or who said what. But if you want to share anything with us, for example, when you saw the word ethnic, what's some of the immediate imagery that came to mind or immediate thoughts? When you saw the word refugee, when you saw the word Muslim, when you saw the word white, what was the initial sort of imagery or thoughts? If anyone's keen to share, please feel free.
I'll share a little bit. I thought it was interesting that when I read the word Australian, for example, despite all the work that we do in trying to reframe our thinking as to what does actually mean to be Australian, I guess this also shows how endemic it is, the narrative that we come across every day. But when I think of Australian, immediately my mind is somebody white. That's what it goes to. Even though we know an Australian can look and look different ways and speak many different languages, but it's one of those things that I suppose we will continue to work on ongoing.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've highlighted a really key point, because the reality is we've been conditioned to see the world in certain ways. And whether we're open to admitting it or not, the reality is we all have unconscious biases. We all make immediate judgments when we see certain people, certain groups, or when we see certain words. And I think your remark of the term Australian is interesting. It's also a very common response that we get in workshops where people go, I consciously know that, you know, being Australian doesn't mean you're a white person, but what came up for me immediately when I saw the word Australian is a white person. And I think, you know, sometimes that realization is really powerful for people to realize that there's often a disconnect between our conscious beliefs and our conscious thoughts and our subconscious ideas that are that sit below the surface of our consciousness, but are very much there outside of our conscious awareness. Just to go back to the comments. So somebody said these are labels, and very true. They can be used particularly in very sort of stereotypical ways, in very negative ways. Somebody's mentioned when they saw the word Muslim, they immediately think hijab, which is also interesting, because obviously there are Muslim women who do not wear the hijab. But it's interesting that we make those associations. Somebody said that for each of the words that they saw, they sort of think of a person, which is also very true for a lot of people, is that we often think of a particular person that we know. So if I have, I don't know, what could I use? So if I have one Muslim friend, for example, if I see the word Muslim, I might think of them immediately. Or if I have, a certain experience with Asia, for example, I might immediately go to that when I see the word Asia. So that is very much the nature of bias, is that we have these sort of inbuilt, largely unconscious ideas that sit below that surface of consciousness, but are very much influencing our everyday thinking in ways that sometimes we're not really aware of.
I think this exercise is also important to really link that idea of systemic racism with unconscious bias. So a lot of us are in the human rights work or working with refugees, and we're in this space where we've done a lot of critical self-reflection and self-awareness to try to break some of those systemic stereotypes and values and norms that we've been conditioned to, just you know, being raised in, if you were raised in Australia or another Western context, or even moving to Australia and then getting inundated with those narratives. So I think it's important to also look critically at yourself from almost like a meta perspective, and to catch yourself to think, okay, you know, when I think Black, I think thief, for example. I know that's the initial thing, but I can check myself to think now, no, actually, you know, I'm looking at myself critically, and I understand that that's a stereotype. Or white, you know, now it's Karen. A lot of people think Karen, or privilege and power, which is a very interesting kind of development in the last couple of years, but really critically reflecting on those stereotypes and how we are self-aware to break them, whether that is through our circles and building that diversity of those circles around us. But mostly it's being able to empathize with others and be able to step into other people's shoes with other experiences than our own.
Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of stepping in people's shoes as well, it's that notion of empathy that I mentioned at the start, because we know that the reality is, for myself as a Black woman, I only have the experience of being a Black woman. I live in you know, in a world where, you know, I'm very much aware of systems of racism, of privilege and oppression, but I'm also mindful that there's a certain degree to which I can do that stepping into, but I'm also limited in some ways because of my own personal experience, in the same way that Liz will be limited in her personal experience as a white person. There's a question here in the chat box that I might just sort of speak to. So as women from a position of privilege, how can I talk to people of color about race so I can be helpful? Do I even have a right to? I think it really comes back to self-awareness, and we'll speak at the end about this notion of allyship and what that looks like in practice. But I think it's about, and the fact that you've recognized that you come from a position of privilege, I think is one really critical step, because I think often people miss that and they sort of approach conversations or situations from a place of ignorance, but they don't even know that they're ignorant, if that makes sense. And sometimes they might then ask certain questions that actually come from sort of stereotypes or racist ideas that they've been conditioned to sort of believe, but don't even know they have. So in terms of how do we talk about you know, issues of race and racism, I think it's about recognizing that position of privilege. It's about recognizing that you need to approach a conversation with a sense of empathy, but the recognition and being open to that discomfort that naturally comes with talking about race and racism. I think it's also about, when people share their experiences, what is our immediate response? Sometimes people get into, and again, it's largely unconscious, but if somebody brings up an experience of racism that they've had, sometimes the immediate response is, or maybe they didn't mean it, and maybe this is what they meant instead, and maybe that person wasn't trying to be hateful towards you. And it's not done with sort of malicious intent. It may be done with the intent of trying to comfort that person, but what that does, it doesn't acknowledge their experience, and it actually contributes to the denial of racism without the person even realizing. So it's also about being open to that discomfort and very much being conscious of that action bias, the need to jump in and provide a solution, or the need to jump in and provide an immediate response. I'll leave it at that because we are going to talk to it a little bit more towards the end in terms of allyship.
Yeah, so this slide is just more of a personal reflection. We've kind of gone through some deep concepts. So just to give you a minute or two of pause, just to bring this back to you as an individual, you as a representative of your organization, but think through some of these questions. So as personally, what is your relationship with structural racism? How often does it come up in your daily lives, and how often do you start that conversation around your relationship with structural racism? Is your organization as diverse as the community you serve? So looking at the different dimensions of diversity, which we didn't go into as deeply because this is a session specifically focused on race, but reflecting on the people around you. So there's an activity we do in mostly face-to-face workshops where we actually have people look at the 10 people closest to them and looking at those dimensions of diversity and understanding that the people closest to you are the ones that are really influencing your worldview, your values, your beliefs. And look, if there's more, if it's more homogenous, then you're not really able to get that those different perspectives, to be able to step into those different shoes and understand those different lived experiences and diversity of experiences of others. So really critically reflecting on not only, maybe extended family, but your friendship circles, your work circles, what is the racial distribution in your organization and ethnic distribution? What about the other dimensions of diversity? To start thinking in those terms and placing yourself in those environments as well. How has your power and privilege operated and manifested in the work you do? So looking intrinsically at different levels of power and privilege or disadvantage as well, and how that actually operates and affects your position within an organization, for example, your ability to carry out your work, and your ability to live a happy, healthy, constructive life as well. These are issues that impact every facet of our lives. And lastly, are racial minorities represented in the executive and leadership roles of your organization? So reflecting on that, and Shabnam will go more deeply into this, but just to start this conversation and this reflection on looking at that power and understanding that diversity doesn't just mean getting people of color into your organization, but actually placing those people equally throughout that organization to accurately represent the communities you're trying to serve. And that starts with putting people in leadership roles and positions of power to be able to enforce that change.
Yeah, I think another key thing to keep in mind, often when we talk about power in terms of, or even representation at executive and leadership levels, and having a level of racial diversity, I think sometimes people equate diversity in leadership or in an organization generally with maybe a lessening of quality of candidates, or that means that suddenly we have to just let anyone through the door because they are of a certain ethnic or racial background. And that could not be further from the truth. I think it's about really looking deeply into what structures do you have in place at your in terms of your hiring practices, and is that actually are there sort of inbuilt biases that disadvantage certain candidates and actually advantage some, that is producing maybe a lack of racial diversity within the organization, particularly at the leadership level. So it's not about just letting anyone through the door for the sake of having diversity within an organization, but it's actually about looking at your systems and are they developed in such a way that it provides sort of an equality of opportunity and access for people to be able to access opportunities within the organization. I remember not long ago we had an organization that we did training for where I think it was like workplace diversity training or something, and one of the sort of very senior people within the organization said, just in sort of reflection after the workshop, she said, oh yeah, the workshop was great. It was really interesting to think through some of the concepts, and some of the questions that the facilitators posed to us were interesting because, white people are well within the minority in our organization. And it was very interesting sort of hearing that, because I'm aware that while white people are the minority, the reality is all executive and senior level positions were occupied by white people, and all people of color or non-white employees were all at lower levels. So I think sometimes there's also a bit of a disconnect where people go, well, oh no, we're diverse. We've got diversity within our organization. But yes, you've got diversity, but diversity only exists at a certain level. So in terms of, access to, opportunities, for example, for advancement, if you've created a structure, whether that's conscious or not, but you have a structure in place that is effectively, sort of disadvantaging some at the expense of others, then no, you are not, equitable in your organization and how you operate. So I think it's about looking at these questions at a deeper level as well.
We've come to great strides in Australia, following probably in the UK's footsteps of reporting on gender pay gap. I don't know if your organizations are required to do that, but not only looking at pay differences between different genders in the same position, but looking, like Elizabeth said, across the organization and that power and privilege in terms of as an organization, what are those differences across the board as a whole, and so looking at things more holistically. We challenge a lot when we talk with different companies. We challenge to say, look, yes, that's a mandated requirement in Australia if you have 200 plus employees at your organization, but what can we do to look at the other dimensions of diversity? So racial pay gap and in terms of gender identity and the other things. And I think that comes down to first recognizing what diversity is in your organization, actually recording it, and then moving on from there. So we won't go into that as much, but it's just kind of something to think about as well when we look at power and privilege in the work we do.
Okay. I'll just give you a moment to sort of take this in. So in terms of some of the key terms that we went through earlier, we talked about this notion of ethnocentrism. And in terms of bias as well, I think you could effectively argue that both women are correct. In terms of, I guess if you looked at it in context, you could argue that they're both right. I think that's the nature of how, when we talk about, issues of identity, for example, it very much comes from a place of, we make assumptions about, everything really, based on what we have been sort of throughout that process of socialization, how we've been raised, what we've been brought up, the values and the beliefs and the social norms that we deem as normal influence the way that we perceive the world around us, and then therefore how we engage and interact with that world around us. So this is a good example of how somebody would see themselves in a certain way, in a certain light, and therefore that lens that they have also influences how they would effectively judge or view others, whether it's in terms of dress or actions or beliefs, etc. All right, so in terms of systemic racism, so looking at racial bias within the media, this is an example of how, I guess, beliefs and ideas and sort of dominant narratives around race work to then further certain narratives within the media. So this is an example during the New Orleans, the Hurricane Katrina. So this happened, this was on the same day, I think only sort of within, a number of hours difference. So you've got the person at the top who's described as, so it says a young man walks through chest deep water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And the other one says that 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. They're effectively both doing the same thing. One is positioned as committing a crime, as looting, and one is positioned as finding food, as doing what would be humanly expected during a hurricane, that you go and look for food to survive. But it's very interesting when you look at the difference of terminology that is used to describe the exact same action. And that's the nature of how racial bias and systems of oppression can then operate at that sort of institutional level in terms of the media. And we know that the media is hugely powerful because it influences stereotypes and the ideas that people form about different groups in society. The fact that criminality is associated with being Black, for example, or being Muslim, that's not an accident. We've been conditioned to see the world in a certain way. And we're constantly bombarded with everyday examples that continue to sort of deepen that conditioning. And a lot of the time, we're not even aware that we're taking on these everyday messaging. So it's also about being conscious, I guess, of our consumption of what we take in, but also being conscious of when we read something like this, you know, how many people or how many people do you imagine had read both articles and didn't even question what they read? How many people read that first one and you know, assumed, as it described, that young man was looting? How many people looked to the second image and said, oh yeah, they were finding food, without even questioning what they're reading? So it's also about that consciousness of, you know, are we aware of what we take on? Are we asking deep and meaningful questions that allow us to sort of unpack? Or are we simply seeing things at face value and then making assumptions and then furthering those stereotypes that largely sort of become unconscious?
We challenge you as well, like in the context of this conference and the work you do with refugees, how could this example translate towards what's shown in the media in terms of the work that you do? And how is that messaging and those stereotypes around working with refugees impacting your work, for example? So a lot of this is paralleling and translating back again to the work we do in our organizations and understanding how insidious the media can really play a part in informing kind of some of these negative stereotypes and biases. And to respond to the question, how can we challenge the media systems which keep these stereotypes alive? It's by pausing, stopping, and picking up on these things. So that comes through self-awareness and self-reflection and actually actively working towards undoing some of those biases. And we'll go further into that as we move forward. All right, so moving into saviorism, or I think it has been previously called white saviorism or the white savior complex. Oh, we have a hand raised. Yes.
Yeah, hello both. Thanks for coming back to my hand. Yeah, can you please bring back the previous slide? Yeah, it's great actually. It's a great one to demonstrate. But actually to start, you know, thinking in action against, or let's say adversely to the systematic racism. Just for example, because the media and the marketing is always associating things implicitly, as you mentioned. Some people will read, but they may not question why these two pictures are actually, the action is the same, but actually the definition of it is different. When one is really too hard on the guy and the other is so like rightful for people to find food. In our field of refugee advocacy, starting from this refugee conference to the previous ones and all the pamphlets, all the flyers we do, when we need to picture a work of refugee, definitely there would be a Black person or Black girl or woman, and then a Muslim lady miserable with a hijab. Well, actually we are helping, okay, we are helping the marketing of this implicit association in the brains of the viewers. Where what I can see is that why don't we, for example, put a Muslim lady with a proper hijab, not miserable, having a book in her hand, okay, for example, or any other lady also from the African background, looking nice and tidy, because this is the reality. They are not miserable or vulnerable people. They have experienced unfortunate events that led them to be. But when these unfortunate events or circumstances will be lifted, these guys will come back like you and me and everyone who is here, maybe going to the university and getting degrees, being teacher, being doctor and lawyer. And like this refugee conference now we are attending this morning, we have a beautiful minds, genius minds talking. Well, actually, we are refugees as well. But I think we should start from ourselves in order to unpack actually the good image instead of putting the other image. I don't know where we putting that one to ask people, please get the sympathy to me because I am a refugee. Then no, it's not like that at all. We don't need the sympathy. We have the right to be asylum seekers. We have the right to be refugees here, according to the human rights. And then we have the right to go to universities and speak the language and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think that's very well taken. And I agree with you entirely, I think, in what you've shared. It's very true that the term refugee has become synonymous with pity, with need, with, a handout. And I think it's very unfortunate because, like you said, the majority of people that have a refugee experience, and I speak as one, do not want to be pitied, do not want to hand out, do not want to be viewed as inherently unable to do anything, and should just be grateful for being in Australia. And I think that that's something that comes up a lot of the time, where when there are human rights violations or when somebody rightly makes a complaint about being mistreated, there's almost a backlash of, well, you should be grateful because if it wasn't for us, or if it wasn't for the fact that you were resettled, you wouldn't be alive or you wouldn't be here. And therefore you have no grounds to complain or you have no grounds to speak up. And I think that that's a very unsettling and I think deeply unjust thing that people continue to encounter, because it's almost like, shut up and be grateful. But it's like, well, if my rights are being violated, I have a right, because this is human rights, I have a right to speak up and to seek safety and protection, or to be, to be equally supported in whatever way that I need to be, in the same manner that a white Australian, for example, does. But I think it's very unfortunate that is the dominant narrative, that if you are a refugee, you should just be grateful, that people should pity you, and therefore, it's like take it or leave it. Like, if you don't like it, go back to your country. The classic sort of, backlash that I think a lot of people hear as well when they speak up.
This actually leads us quite nicely into our discussion of saviorism, and saviorism, particularly that frame of mind in the refugee advocacy work that we do. So saviorism is, whether it's through time or money, people of privilege or companies or organizations in a place of privilege wanting to give back to communities that are underserved or marginalized in order to balance out injustices of the world. Although these might be well-intentioned, short-lived actions, they do not necessarily disrupt the very reason this need for rebalance is occurring in the first place. So going back to reevaluating those underlying systems of oppression that are putting people there in the first place. So the first principle in our work that we do is to do no harm. There is an idea that those that we are helping ought to be consulted over the matters that concern them. The saviorism has a tendency to render refugees incapable of helping themselves, infantile or helpless victims who are here to survive. That narrative needs to be reframed, and we need to check that those narratives of saviorism in the organizations that we work. We empower the people that we work, that we build capacity and support those people who have been dispossessed, perceived as dispossessed of agency. We will go more into what that means, but this is kind of just setting the tone of what kind of we don't want to do in the work we do.
Yeah. And I think just to add, I think it can be very challenging because I think we have to confront the fact that sometimes we will need to do things in ways that are very different to how we are accustomed or how it has sort of benefited us in some way. And I say this because as Liz was talking, I remember very clearly, and it was actually one of the refugee alternatives conferences that I attended a number of years ago in person, pre-COVID world. And I was doing an in-person presentation on, I can't remember my exact topic, but it was sort of something related to what we're talking about similarly today. And I remember someone in the audience asked me the question. She put her hand up and she said, I have a question. As a white Australian woman, I know, and she worked, I think, at the Human Rights Commission or something, but she had quite a senior position, said, I know that my position should be occupied by a non-white person. What do I do to sort of bridge that gap? And I sort of responded by saying, without resigning. And while that was sort of like a bit of a joke, it was actually a valid question as well, because I think sometimes for people to recognize and to realize that in order to level the playing field, we have to get out of the way and provide opportunities for others. That can be very challenging for people to come to terms with. So I think it's also about being aware, I guess, in terms of privilege, where are you privileged and where are you disadvantaged? And what can you actively do to ensure that you're contributing to level the playing field? Because the reality is it's not an even playing field out there. So it's about being conscious of what do we do to affect change at a personal organizational level. So we'll go into that in terms of allyship now.
All right, so as we go into the different concepts between being non-racist or a bystander, being complicit to racism that occurs in our everyday lives and the work we do, to actively standing up and being anti-racist. We talk about allyship in order to create that change. So someone who promises never to engage in racist behavior will not create the same change as those who promise to work towards removing racism still present in today's society. And I think that's really an important point. Going to the second point, the issue with I don't see color, that's a very, very common statement. And I think often it comes from a place of ignorance, and it might be well-intentioned, but actually it's quite damaging, that we need to first recognize and be comfortable talking about race, so that we don't invalidate those experiences of the people who experience racism. Next, if we fail to acknowledge a person's experience, we invalidate them. So that comes back to that. Having a place of empathy, stopping, listening, not jumping to action, not coming up with reasons why you don't necessarily believe that person's experience, but actually supporting them in whatever they're going through. Again, that's being able to put yourself in other people's shoes. And lastly, acknowledging that there is structural racism around us. There are inequities around us, and we can't necessarily overcome, ignore, or move past them, but we need to be a part of that conversation. Everyone needs to be a part of that conversation.
And I think recognizing that choosing to do nothing means that you're also part of the problem.
Yep, so I'll just fly through this. This is kind of what we talked about, that being a bystander. So just like Liz said, not standing up, not saying anything. My partner was in line to, he was getting his COVID vaccine. I showed up because I was there supporting him and was offered a vaccine. I was the fifth person in the queue. I was the one white person in the queue, and I was preferenced over the 4 other people of color, not because I was more deserving of the 4 vaccines they had left, with 5 of us there, but because I felt like there was a racial bias in regards to my whiteness. I could have easily, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, COVID's rampant. I could have taken that that offer to get the vaccine, but no, I recognize that is systemic racism, that's injustice. You know, I need to say, look, you know, I did come here last. These people came before me. That's not right. And that's kind of what being an upstander is in regards to the last couple days, but taking a stand and not just being complicit.
Okay. So in terms of what does this look like? And I think Liz's example with, you know, her current experience to get the COVID vaccine is a great example of, she recognized there was an injustice, and we could argue that it was probably racial, because as the only white person being number 5 in the line, why would you not call the first, you know, 4 people that were ahead of her who were non-white? So what does it mean in terms of being anti-racist? What does it mean in terms of actively working towards creating change, not only at an individual level, but at a systemic level? You can see through this graph that there's various sort of zones. You've got the fear zone. So within that, it's that denial of racism, denying that it is a problem, avoiding the question, you know, saying that, you know, I'm not going to engage in that because it's uncomfortable. And again, sometimes being conscious, but also for a lot of people, it's largely unconscious, only to talking to people who are like them in some way, who look like them. So in terms of, like, you know, your circle, as, you know, for example, as a white person, having a very white circle of friends, and anything outside of that becomes sort of, comes with a certain level of discomfort. The next zone is about recognizing that racism is a reality, that it does exist. It's about seeking, you know, questions that make us uncomfortable. So that sort of a gradual acceptance of being uncomfortable, understanding where people, you know, sit within the system of privilege as well. But also knowing that with that level of privilege comes a certain level of, I can choose not to worry about it if I don't want to, because that's not a reality for me. So being aware that there's a choice with even ignoring racism when you don't have a daily lived experience. People who are in that learning zone are also starting to educate themselves. So they may be exposing themselves to alternative forms of media. So that graph we saw earlier of the floods in the US, for example, an example could be that somebody might see that and go, you know, that doesn't sit well with me. You know, why, you know, the young man is clearly, you know, looking for food to survive. Why is he being positioned as a criminal? So starting to ask some of those deeper questions because of that recognition that there is an element of racism and structural racism within the media. It may then be seeking alternative sources of media to be sort of informed of what's going on outside of the dominant media channels. It's about allowing that sense of vulnerability around recognizing biases and then being open to listen to others. When you're moving into the growth zone, it is that zone where you're actively educating yourself, yielding to positions of power to those who are otherwise marginalized. So the example I gave earlier, so rather than occupy a position that you know very well is not for you, actually actively fighting for change within the organization to say, this position ought to be occupied by such and such candidate, and then actively working towards that.
In the interest of time and to give Shabnam her full time to share her part, we do have some self-reflective questions that we can put up at the end of the workshop. But lastly, it's just looking at in terms of, so now we looked at individually, what does that look like in our daily lives, but also as an organization, what does that translate to? So again, reiterating our points of that lived experience driven leadership, getting people across the organization involved to represent the communities we serve, incorporating social justice into our management. So really upskilling our leadership teams and our management to be able to deliver and to be able to have that lens to lead their teams in an equitable and inclusive way. Also a shameless plug probably for our organization. training, looking at the structures of our companies and evaluating that, reevaluating them for inclusivity, gathering research on our diversity and inclusion in our company, and again, upskilling everyone, not just at the top, not just at the bottom, but across our organization. We will put our email in as well if you have any more questions, but we will hand off now to Shabnam Safa, and she will go more into what that looks like on a practical level.
Thanks, Liz and Elizabeth, and thank you everyone else for staying through that session. I know we're a little short on time, but I'll try and be brief. As Elizabeth and Liz said at the start, these are not topics that you can unpack and get through all of the complexities in a 1-hour workshop, but hopefully gives an opportunity to start some of these conversations. I'll try and tie in specifically where this all fits in terms of including lived experience voices in the refugee work, policy and advocacy work. But I think the question of why lived experience is important at the heart of it, at the core, it comes down to the understanding that given the opportunity and the right resources, those who are directly impacted by an issue are best placed to devise most effective and efficient solutions for their own challenges. Now, obviously, this becomes a little more complicated when you're talking about tens of millions of people displaced around the world from very contrasting geopolitical regions, cultures and communities, but we shouldn't shy away from starting this conversation because agency and active participation of those who are living this reality or who have lived the reality in decisions that affect them does matter. And for a long time in this line of work, this has largely been restricted to very storytelling type platforms where we invite refugees to come and share their stories, so then we can get a better perspective in our work, which is great. Changing the importance of stories is significant in shaping narratives and public discourses, but people with lived experience have more to offer and need to have the space to advocate for the policy or policies that affect them, need to be included in decision-making tables, so then they can, have contributions in better decision-making practices, because inherently they do bring experiences that you otherwise would have missed out on if you didn't have them in the room. They bring the understanding and expertise of how the decisions and policies that are made are implemented and impact people on the ground. But often we run into, it's still a very new concept. We're still in very uncharted waters. So there is no criticism at all in this space. I'm very welcoming the opportunity to have this conversation. From my observations, I do see that we don't really know what to do with the lived experience of people who go through these issues. Often we are either pigeonholed and seen entirely through that lived experience, or seen completely without it. Elizabeth and Liz referred to the term or the phrase "I don't see color," which I see as a very problematic stance to have, and unfortunately, a lot of us we still do. And when it comes to that lived experience of refugees in this line of work, we're often some of the work that we have been doing within our communities to try and bring and translate that into our day-to-day professions, there's still a bit of a disconnect. You know, when I say that we're either seen through our lived experience or without it, there is still an understanding that, you know, your advocacy work, your community work is not professional work. I've been in countless interviews where I have been asked, okay, that's great, but, you know, do you have any professional examples to share about this thing that you're talking about? And that's because I wasn't getting paid for the experience that I shared, because I was doing that, you know, voluntarily, out of necessity and need that I see at in filling a gap. And, you know, I'm not getting paid because that experience is not seen as professional experience, and that experience is not seen as professional experience because I'm not getting paid for it. It's just this vicious cycle that we get ourselves caught up in our own organizational structures. It becomes quite problematic because we, by we, I mean, you know, refugees with lived experience, or people with lived experience of racism, or people of color generally, are either on the ground, you know, the coal face of an organization, working with the community, really building that work of the organization, or on the board in the outward facing leadership, as you know, at times from very well-intentioned leadership, a bit of a show of, look at how diverse our organization is, look at all of these people of color that we have on our boards, but they don't really have much of a say in what goes on in the day-to-day of that organization. It's the middle management that makes the biggest difference, and it's also the middle management that are the biggest gateholders in this line of work, and they are largely white people, very well-meaning, very well-intentioned white people, but at times, you know, the experiences from the ground, the staff at the ground level don't really get translated up. It doesn't make it to the board, and there is that disconnect, and we find ourselves in this loop of constantly trying to solve a problem that can actually, you know, needs to bring different perspectives together. Diversity and inclusion in organizations is usually seen as one person's job, like someone will hire a diversity and inclusion officer, and then it's their job to fix the issues of an entire organization, and everyone else can take a back step. And, you know, sometimes it also happens to be a person of color in that role, who, in my opinion, are set up to fail from the very beginning, because, you know, they're not in a system, they're not in an environment that is supporting their work, that understands that, you know, everyone else will need to change for them to be successful in their work. And you know, after a while, we can there have been countless examples of companies, organizations going, well, we tried and it didn't work, so, you know, we might as well just forget about it, without dissecting what the real reasons behind failure in that work is. And that also runs the risk of that work remaining very tokenistic as well. It gets reduced to a diversity and inclusion committee, for example, with no real power or teeth to make any difference in our organizations, or to affect any change at all. I often hear examples of people saying, yes, our organizations are diverse. It's you know, we have a lot of people in doing from very different backgrounds in across our teams, and this particular example was from someone from the corporate sector, and upon asking, I found out that by a lot of diverse people in the organization, they meant that their IT team is entirely people of color, or their finance team is entirely that people of color, but everyone else not so much. And, you know, you go, well, that's not diversity, that's isolating people to a certain stereotype, and really not seeing beyond that box that we have fit them in. In the interest of time, I'll put some questions to you in around, you know, just reflecting that how many of you in your own organizations are actively trying to establish structures that are supporting and empowering BIPOC. You know, how many of us are really aware of what systemic barriers are they up against. You know, when I shared that we're pigeonholed in certain roles when it comes to refugee experience, you know, most of people from refugee backgrounds in these organizations are hired as community engagement officers, because, you know, that's seen as the highest value that they bring, the connection to the community, which is great. A lot of people do, and it does need to be someone from that community in that role. But we do have other expertise as well, you know, just that the difference between our professional and community experiences, they all do count. So developing inclusive professional development and career progression pathways, you know, mentoring BIPOC people in our organizations, and not letting that be an additional responsibility of the BIPOC people who have established themselves and are struggling and, you know, fighting that upward battle. Others can take a role in it as well. Adequately compensating and recognizing the lived experience of BIPOC staff as well. That, you know, when you do hire someone for their lived experience or for their community connections, how is that actually being recognized in the organization as an additional skill on top of all of these other skills that everyone else in the organization has as well. So that's, you know, when we shift from lived experience towards thinking about it as lived expertise and knowledge, because, you know, just because someone doesn't have a bureaucratic title or haven't done a PhD in this space does not mean that they don't really qualify for that recognition. So recognizing those experiences as professional as well. There's been an increasing and a very welcome focus towards including refugee-led voices, refugee lived experience leadership in all of our work, you know, in the sector and beyond, in Australia and globally. And that is a little overdue, but very, very welcome. And with it brings the risk of also all of us not knowing that it's a bit of a rush towards this, this movement to include lived experience voices and center lived experience voices in our work. But then we're also not allowing ourselves time to really dissect and understand what it really takes to do it well. And, you know, run the risk of it once again becoming very tokenistic, because we're trying to fit a cohort or people into a system that wasn't really designed for that purpose. So I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves whether we are trying to bring these lived experience voices and fitting them into the system, or are we actually also trying to change the system to make their contributions to it a little easier and more impactful as well? There are many, many challenges in this space. I'm not here to provide answers today. I'm here just to draw your attention to the fact that this isn't easy work, and we all need to work in partnership. I see that, you know, often when with this desire to include and center lived experience voices, sometimes, at times, not always, at times the underlying motivation can also be seeking answers and solutions that you haven't been able to find yourselves for years or decades. And that's an unrealistic expectation set on people from these communities. Yes, they do have the expertise. Yes, they do have the knowledge. But, you know, this is a journey. We can provide some preliminary steps to start this journey, but that those answers, those solutions shouldn't be taken as the map to the destination. And it's going to be uncomfortable work, and I invite you to be uncomfortable, and you know, look at it as not having a lived experience work or expertise replacing your work, but adding to it and amplifying the impact, because there is a reason why there's a you know, an increase in numbers of refugee-led organizations or initiatives that are coming up. And that's, you know, saying something in the system isn't working. There is a gap that isn't being filled otherwise, and this is the only way. So if it can be done in our day-to-day, in our already established organized structures, with funding, with resources, then we can mitigate some of the risks and sacrifices that were referred to at the earlier plenary session by Tina Dixon, by Dominic Golding. It takes a lot of work and persistence and sacrifices from those with lived experience to be contributing to this space. Now let it there. I'm so sorry I went over time a little bit, Elizabeth and Liz, but there's lots to say.
Yeah, there definitely is. Thank you for that. I think that was really powerful, and definitely obviously very much in line with that, what we talked about. I think you raised a very key point around that it needs to be meaningful. That people need to be adequately compensated and recognized for the work that they do. I think that there's probably a lot of, there's a lot of a lack of recognition and a lack of valuing, I think, of the work, particularly when it comes from people with lived experience. So thank you. I know we're out of time, and there's people, I can see a few hand ups, and I can see that there's quite a number of questions in the chat box. Shabnam, are you happy to take any questions online? We're certainly okay if you want to reach out to us directly via email if you have specific questions. Liz and I are happy to respond, as I'm sure Shabnam will be. So feel free to reach out to us. We put our email address in the chat box earlier. It's just contact@diversityfocus.com.au. Shabnam, if you have an email, maybe put it in the chat box.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Liz. And I may take this opportunity for a very shameless plug of the upcoming NRAAG dialogue on Thursday as well. So those from in the room here right now, if you are from refugee background, please do come and join us on Thursday from 5 to 8 p.m. AEST to further explore these concepts, but within our own communities and what it really means to tackle this together.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much to everyone. That was a very engaging panel. It's probably one of the most engaged for the day. I think when we do bring up these topics of race and privilege and power, it does incite us to, want to know more, learn more. We're going to have a 15-minute break and we'll be resuming at 3:45 for our next session. Please do take time to fill in the survey, and don't forget you will go in the running to win a Share a Meal, Share a Story cookbook. 3 people will be announced at the end of today and tomorrow. And when we come back, I'll introduce the next session for you, which is finding solutions for refugees on TPVs and SHEVs, sheaves and TPVs. So we'll be back in 15 minutes time at 3:45.